Hi guys, my name is Patrick McCorry. I did my PhD at Newcastle University, and I'm going to be the first UK PhD graduate in cryptocurrencies. So that's fantastic. And now I do my postdoc at UCL with Sarah Meiklejohn. Today I'm going to present you some work I did during my PhD back at Newcastle. It's called a smart contract for boardroom voting with maximum voter privacy. And I did it with Fong Hao, who was my advisor, and my colleague, Siamak. And I also have Twitter. So if you guys want to follow my Twitter and look at my really awful tweets, you're more than welcome to as well. Okay, so this is going to be a bit about e-voting on the blockchain. So let's introduce e-voting a little bit. So in the academic literature, we tend to focus on end-to-end verifiable election systems. And they tend to have three properties. The first property is that I go to a polling station, and I'm on the voting machine, and I'm ready to cast my vote. I should have confidence that the voting machine has recorded my vote. Then when I leave the polling station, I should be able to look at this public bulletin board, that's a fantastic example, and I should be able to see that my vote has actually been recorded in the election. And then after the election's over, and the tally is published and my party wins, I should be able to see that my vote was actually included as part of the tally. Now, to achieve these end-to-end verifiable systems, we tend to rely on this public bulletin board, as I've already alluded to. And that is actually a very good example. So as you can see, this projector provides a consistent view to everybody in the room. And that is what we want for an election. But unfortunately, in practice, the best we've achieved is a single web server where two people connect to the web server and download data. Then they have to try to coordinate amongst themselves to detect if the web server is trying to cheat them. And that's not exactly what we want. So a lot of people have started thinking, okay, can we use the blockchain as a public bulletin board for elections? And I'm going to argue potentially. And even in our little community, this is still quite a controversial thing to argue. Because I mean, the blockchains are, a lot of projects say blockchain is going to save the world. And I'm going to say actually here it might help a little bit. Because the blockchain does provide this desirable consistency property that we're after. And what do I mean by that? So if I run like a Bitcoin node or an Ethereum node, I can download the very first block and then fetch blocks from the network, and I can independently verify history by myself. I do not need to trust any third party. So that's our public bulletin board again. That has a list of transactions, and everybody's guaranteed to have a consistent view of these transactions. Now, obviously, I'm not the first person to think of this, and this is actually from a Google search I did last year. So there is a lot of hype around e-voting on the blockchain. In this case, it's mostly focused on Bitcoin. So now we're going to say, okay, can we use Bitcoin for e-voting? And normally I'd go into Bitcoin, provide some background information, but I don't really need to do that with this audience. But my summary is that Bitcoin is not really good for the purpose that we want. Because one, a transaction can only store 80 bytes of arbitrary data. So that's quite small. And two, Bitcoin cannot enforce the correct execution of our voting protocol. It can only store data. And I'm going to argue that we can do a little bit better than that. So now we go on to Ethereum. Can we use Ethereum to build an e-voting protocol? So back when I made this slide, Ethereum was worth $20 billion. I don't know what it's worth now. It keeps fluctuating. But Ethereum's normally marketed as a global computer. So it's a bit like this. There's a global computer, and everybody has access to it. And it only has public state. So it can't keep any secrets. What I'm going to show in this talk is that, yep, you could imagine Ethereum being a global computer, but it's a bit like being from the 1970s. It's really expensive. It can only run bounded and expressive programs as well. But my main takeaway on Ethereum, and this is mostly based on a little pet hate, is that I've seen people describe Ethereum as verifiable computing. And there's even some blog posts on this topic as well. But that's not strictly correct. Verifiable computing is when I want to run a computation, but I don't have the resources to do that. So I find a cloud, I outsource my computation, they do all the hard work, they give me the result, and a very small proof that they did the computation correctly. But Ethereum doesn't do that. So I would argue that Ethereum is more like consensus computing or replication computing. So what I do is that I store my code on the network, and then I run a function on the network, and every single peer on this network will replicate that computation and reach consensus on the final output of that contract. And that's actually what makes it really beautiful, because it's publicly verifiable. Okay, so that's my little rant over. This talks about voting over the blockchain. So voting on Ethereum, has it already been done? And when I started looking at Ethereum last year, like most people, I went on the Solidity online compiler, and I wanted to say, okay, I want to just get my hands dirty and start writing lots of Solidity. And I discovered that their example program is actually an e-voting program. And it's fairly straightforward. You have a list of proposals, and if I want to cast my vote, I call the vote function, and everybody can see that my Ethereum account voted for this proposal. So there's inherently no voting privacy. The only voting privacy you have is pseudonymity, as in you can see this Ethereum account has voted yes. But as we've learned, that's not good enough, because it's fairly straightforward to link an Ethereum account to a real-world identity. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to say, okay, can I build a smart contract that can preserve the voter's privacy? And there's two standard ways to do this in the literature. The first way is blind signatures. So you can imagine during a registration stage, as a voter, we have a group of voters, and every single voter creates a voting key. Every voter blinds their voting key with some randomness, and then everyone gives their blinded voting key to the election administrator. Then the election administrator will sign each blinded token, and then he'll give it back to the voters at the end of the sign-up stage. And now every voter can unblind their voting key. So that means every single voter now has a signed voting key from the election administrator. So then they can cast their vote using this voting key. And the vote is public, so you can see that this voting key is voted yes. But the whole purpose of this approach is to obfuscate the link between the voter's identity and their voting key. The other approach is fairly straightforward. There's a well-known public key owned by the tallying authority. And when I cast my vote, I simply encrypt my vote under their public key, and I broadcast it to the network. And then at the end of the election administrator, in a publicly verifiable manner, can decrypt all the votes and then publish the tally. But in both approaches, we have to rely on the participation of an authority for our privacy. And when I was working on this problem, I wanted to do a little bit better. I wanted to sort of follow the example of cryptocurrencies. Can we remove the need for any trusted authority to maintain a voter's privacy? And this brings us on to self-tallying elections. Now, what is a self-tallying election? The first paper was in 2002, and I'm really bad at pronouncing names. So I think that's Caius and Young. It's a Greek name, so I definitely can't pronounce it. But these election systems have three different properties. The first is perfect ballot secrecy, as in a voter's privacy can only be breached by a full collusion of all other voters. It's self-tallying. So once the final vote has been cast, anybody can compute the tally. We no longer have to rely on any authority to give us the tally. And it's dispute-free. So given the entire transcript of the election, I can verify myself independently that the election was run correctly. Now, I do have a disclaimer. The three protocols I'll mention are not end-to-end verifiable. That thing I mentioned at the very start of the talk. Because in an end-to-end verifiable system, we also do not trust the voting machine. So I go to the polling station, and I have to convince myself that the voting machine is not cheating me. So in our system, our voting protocol is completely decentralized, so there's no central authority to provide any infrastructure. So we have to assume that the voting machine is trustworthy, because I'm going to cast my vote from my mobile phone. And I believe this is a reasonable assumption, because if you compromise my phone and you compromise my wallet, you're probably going to steal all my money. And that's probably a little bit worse than my voting privacy. But one issue is that self-tallying elections have had a short-lived history. There has never been a practical implementation because they tend to rely on an authenticated broadcast channel. And it's also quite beneficial to have a public bulletin board to aid the coordination amongst the voters. And these protocols are also not seen as practical because of two issues. The first issue is an abortive issue. So a single voter can stop the entire election. And that's the nature of a decentralized system. The other issue is an adaptive issue. The final voter can compute the tally before everybody else because it's self-tallying. And I'm going to argue that using the blockchain and combining them with self-tallying elections, we can somewhat get around some of these issues. and make a self-tenant election somewhat practical. And I'm going to argue we can use Ethereum. So I built the voting protocol as a smart contract. And what's beautiful about using Ethereum is that the network itself enforces the correct execution of our voting protocol. And it also provides us an incentive for people to participate. So the idea is that when I register for an election, I have to leave a small deposit. And then once I cast my vote, I get refunded my small deposit. And setting that deposit value is actually quite difficult and will mostly depend on the application. Now, there's 3 different protocols that I could have chose, and I decided to use the Open Vote Network. And I will have another disclaimer. This protocol was by my PhD advisor, but that is not why we chose this protocol. As you can see there, it's a 2-round protocol, and it only has 2 zero-knowledge proofs per voter. So it's the most efficient of all the protocols that exist. So now I'm going to talk about the Open Vote Network over Ethereum and how roughly I implemented it. So we do have an election administrator. This is more of an implementation issue. And the reason we have an election administrator is for 2 roles. First, he sets the list of eligible voters in the smart contract, i.e. links their Ethereum account to, for example, a real-world identity, because voters need to have a meaningful identity. And second, the election administrator is responsible for poking the smart contract and telling the contract to move on to the next stage. And he does that, and he pokes Ethereum to say, okay, allow voters to begin registering for an election. So as a voter, I can look at the contract, and I can look at the voting question. And you can imagine this question is, should Satoshi Nakamoto reveal his real-world identity? Now, if I want to vote on this issue, what I do is the following. I compute a voting key, which is essentially the public key, an elliptic curve public key, and I also have the corresponding private key to that public key. So now I have a voting key. I now compute a zero-knowledge proof that proves that I know the corresponding secret key. So now what I do is I create a transaction. I include the voting key. I include my zero-knowledge proof. And I also include a small deposit as dictated by the smart contract. And then I broadcast that out to the network. And every voter does this. So the Ethereum will verify the proof to ensure that the voting key is well-formed, etc., etc. And if it's convinced, it will store the voting key, and it will also store my deposit. Now, once a sufficient number of voters have registered for the election administrator will poke Ethereum to move on to the voting stage. And now, during this transition from the sign-up to the voting stage, the smart contract will now compute a second key for every single voter. And we call this the reconstructed key. Now, I have this really ugly formula on screen, and that doesn't mean anything to anybody in this room. So I'm going to use a little robot and cute little stickman to sort of explain the intuition. So if you consider I'm voter 3, so I'm the little robot, what the contract will do is that it will get the voting key of voter 1 and 2 and multiply them together. Then it will get the voting key of 4 and 5 and multiply them together. Now we get those two results and we divide them. And that will give me my voting key, which is g to the power of y3. And we do this for every single voter. So you'll notice that all these keys have some type of special form. And that's really where the magic happens later on. So now we've transitioned, and now we're at the voting stage. And every single voter has 2 keys. One is their voting key that they computed themselves on their personal device, and the reconstructed key that was computed by the smart contract. Now if I want to cast my vote, I can either vote yes or no. And that's represented by g to the power of 0 or g to the power of 1, where g is our generator. But you don't have to worry about that too much. And now what we do is an El-Gamal encryption. And the random factors used in this encryption is the voting key and the reconstructed key. And as I mentioned, g to the power of v is our vote. So now we have this encrypted vote. What I now do is a second zero-knowledge proof, where I prove my encrypted vote is either yes or no, i.e. either 0 or 1. And I broadcast that out to the network. So every voter will send out their encrypted vote and their zero-knowledge proof. Ethereum will verify the proof. And if it's convinced that the vote is well-formed, it will store the encrypted vote and send back the voter their deposit. And then once the final vote has been cast, at this stage, anybody can compute the tally. And what I've done in our implementation is I require the election administrator to poke Ethereum to compute the tally as well. So then you can simply go on a website and not have to do any computation yourself. And because the computation's fairly cheap, Ethereum can do this. And the way we compute the tally is fairly straightforward. We get all the encrypted votes, we effectively add them together, and then some magic happens, and it effectively cancels out all of the encryption. And all we're left with is g to the power of yes votes. And that's a small discrete log, and it's easily brute forceable. In fact, the contract can brute force it. And now we're left with the number of yes votes. And once you have the number of yes votes, it's very straightforward to get the number of no votes. And that's essentially the Open Vote Network in a nutshell. And it's the second part of our study was an empirical study. We wanted to know, can we run cryptographic protocols on Ethereum? And this was done in 2016. And I've tried the update, back then Ether was $11 each. And then when I made this slide, it was $186. But as you can see, casting a vote required 2.5 million gas. And that's roughly $2. So it's actually fairly expensive to run on Ethereum. And the gas limit today is, I think, 6.7 million gas. So you can fit roughly 3 votes per block. Now, I have been told there's going to be a hard fork in Ethereum that will natively support elliptic curve mathematics. And once that hard fork happens, this should be much, much cheaper to do. I think it may be around 250,000 gas to do, like 10 times cheaper. But obviously, I can't verify that until the hard fork happens. So that's really the main part of my talk. I want to highlight that boardroom voting is feasible today. It's the first of many practical cryptographic applications to come. And the GitHub now has 80 plus stars, so people in the community seem to be behind the idea and they enjoy it. And I also have a very small video, so if there's time, okay, I will show the video as well. I'm hoping there's no sound. I'm going to mute the video because I sound like a big kid in the video.
Administrator logs in. He'll up.
So as you can see there, the election administrator, it's setting the, one sec, could I do that? Oh no, that's fine, I did that on purpose. Because the first part's just me setting up the system. So if I just speed this up a little bit, okay, so at this stage, this is the election administrator, and he's setting up the election. So there he's setting the list of eligible voters. If I put this in full screen. Okay, so he sets the list of eligible voters, and then he sets a list of parameters, like timers for the election. So that ensures the election runs in a timely manner. And then he sets the voting question, the deposit required, and then he sends that off to Ethereum. So this will create a transaction that will talk to the smart contract. And now, each voter, they'll upload their voting codes, which is essentially a list of random numbers they compute themselves. Then they can look at the voting question, and they can decide if they want to register for the election. And each voter will do this. The important bit is that their Ethereum wallet is running in the background. So this is talking to their Ethereum wallet, and it is sending like one Ether to the contract. And there's 3 voters in my example. I wish I could make the video go a little bit faster. But the next stage will be that the election administrator can see the 3 voters have registered. He'll finish the registration stage, and now each voter, in fact, this version of the protocol has 3 rounds. So in this round, they commit to their encrypted vote. And then once all voters have committed, they can then cast their vote. So each voter casts their vote, and then once the final vote has been cast, anyone can compute the tally. But I've also programmed it so the election administrator pokes Ethereum to compute the tally as well. So there you go. The election administrator hits get tally. We can see the tally. And I also made a live feed page, or live feed, where we can actually see the election in progress. So you can see the 3 people have cast their vote, and you can see the final tally. And that's the system in practice. And that's the end of my talk.
Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Any questions?
Yeah, so I actually removed that slide. So yeah, so the first issue with the abortive issue, if the final voter, if someone doesn't cast their vote, they lose their deposit. So that's sort of like the crypto economic part of it. You have to create an incentive where The deposit has to be high enough for people to vote, but it needs to be low enough where people are willing to leave a deposit. The second issue, the adaptive issue, that was to do with the final voter can compute the tally before everybody else. So what you can do, and it's actually in that video, you can create a third round where we have the sign-up stage, the commitment stage, and the voting stage. So in the commitment stage, what you effectively do is commit to your encrypted vote. So I send the hash of my encrypted vote. So then when you get to the voting stage, the final voter can still compute the tally before everybody else, but he can't change his vote because he's already committed to it. But the problem there is there's 3 rounds of interaction, so then there's a trade-off. If that's a big enough issue, you have 3 rounds. If you don't think it's a big enough issue, you just keep the 2 rounds. I mean, even 2 rounds is quite difficult for most people to do. That's what we're starting to learn in the usability world here.
Anyone else? All right, thank you.
Yay.